There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a house in Arizona after midnight. The heat of the day finally releases its grip on the roof, the neighborhood stops moving, and the only sound left is the low, steady hum of the central air conditioning working to keep the rooms breathable. For most of my life, I never heard that sound. I would put my head on the pillow, close my eyes, and wake up when the sun came through the blinds. But a few years ago, that silence became my enemy. The night became a long, frustrating corridor of waking up, staring at the ceiling, and waiting for the inevitable urge that forced me out of bed. I used to dread the evening. I would go through my nightly inventory, walking through the house here in Scottsdale, checking the locks on the front door, making sure the garage was closed, turning off the lamps in the living room, and adjusting the thermostat. I did everything I was supposed to do to prepare for rest. But as I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, I felt a heavy knot of anticipation in my stomach. I knew what was coming. I knew that no matter how tired my bones felt, no matter how much physical labor I had done in the yard that afternoon, the bed was not a place of recovery anymore. It was just a waiting room. I would fall asleep quickly enough, usually around 10 o'clock. But by 1 in the morning, my eyes would snap open. The urge would be there, undeniable and sharp. I would throw off the covers, swing my legs over the side of the bed, and make the slow walk to the bathroom in the dark. I would go back to bed, finally drift off, and then at 3 in the morning, the cycle would repeat. Sometimes it happened again at 5. By the time the sun actually came up, I felt like a machine that had been turned off and on a dozen times during the night, the battery completely drained, the wires frayed, the engine sputtering. I told myself the same comfortable lie that millions of older adults tell themselves every single day. I told myself that this was simply the cost of living past a certain age. I assumed my plumbing was just breaking down. I figured that my bladder was shrinking, or that the internal valves were losing their tension, the way an old rubber gasket dries out and cracks over time. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a man who worked in a manufacturing plant his entire life. We were taught to accept physical deterioration as a natural consequence of putting miles on the odometer. You don't complain about a squeaky wheel on an 80-year-old wagon. You just keep pulling it. So, I tried to fix it the way any logical man would try to fix a leak. I tried to shut off the main water valve. I started restricting my liquids. At first, I stopped drinking anything after dinner. When that did not work, I moved the deadline back. By 4 in the afternoon, I would not let a single drop of water pass my lips. Living in the dry heat of the desert, this was a miserable existence. My mouth felt like sandpaper. My throat ached. I would eat my evening meal, feeling parched, staring at the faucet in the kitchen, trying to will myself not to turn it on. I was deliberately dehydrating my entire system, forcing my body to run dry, all in a desperate attempt to buy myself a few uninterrupted hours of sleep. It did not work. I would go to bed with a desert in my throat, completely parched, and at 2 in the morning the urge would strike again. I would walk to the bathroom in the dark, thoroughly confused. I had not consumed a drop of liquid in 8 hours. Where was this water coming from? How was my body manufacturing liquid out of thin air? I felt betrayed by my own biology. I felt like I was losing control of the most basic functions of my existence. The exhaustion began to bleed into my days. When you do not sleep, you do not actually live. You just exist in a state of continuous survival. The brain fog rolled in thick and heavy by noon. I had no patience for the small frustrations of the day. I stopped working on projects in the garage because my hands felt unsteady. I stopped going for my long morning walks because my legs felt like they were filled with wet cement. Sleep is the foundation of the house, and when the foundation is compromised, the walls start to crack, the doors stop closing right, and the roof begins to sag. My foundation was eroding, one fragmented night at a time. The answer did not come from a doctor's office. It did not come from a specialized clinic or a prescription bottle. It came on a Sunday afternoon when my daughter Laura stopped by the house. Laura is a registered nurse in Phoenix, and she possesses a terrifying ability to notice the things you're trying very hard to hide. I had been sitting in my armchair, trying to keep my eyes open while we talked. I had my shoes off, resting my feet on the carpet. Laura stopped talking mid-sentence and looked down at my ankles. She got up from the sofa, walked over, and pressed her thumb firmly against the skin just above my sock line. When she pulled her thumb away, a deep white indentation remained in my skin for a long time before slowly filling back in. She sat back on her heels and looked up at me. She asked me how many times I was getting up to use the bathroom at night. I was defensive. I told her it was none of her business. I told her I was just getting old, my plumbing was giving out, and I was managing it by not drinking water after 4 o'clock. Laura shook her head. She told me I was looking at the wrong end of the pipe. She told me the problem was not my bladder, and the problem was not what I was drinking in the evening. The problem was gravity. She explained it to me using the language of construction and fluid dynamics, the only language I really trust. She told me to think about my cardiovascular system as a closed loop of pipes. Your heart is the main pump, pushing oxygen and nutrients through the clean pipes, the arteries, all the way down to your toes. Once the blood delivers the goods, it has to come back up to the lungs and the heart through the return pipes, the veins. But the return trip is difficult. The blood has to fight a vertical climb against gravity. When we are young, the muscles in our legs and the tiny one-way valves inside our veins are tight and efficient. They act like a series of locks on a canal, pushing the fluid up, closing the gate, pushing it up again. But after 60, after 70, those valves get a little worn. The muscles lose a bit of their tension. The pump is not quite as forceful as it used to be. Laura explained that as I walked around my house, as I stood in my garage, as I sat in my armchair throughout the day, the fluid in my blood was slowly seeping out of the capillaries and pooling in the tissues of my lower legs. The basement was flooding. Because the return pump could not keep up with gravity, my calves and ankles were acting as a massive storage tank for excess water. That was the indentation her thumb had left. It was edema. It was water trapped in the basement. And then she explained the nighttime cycle, and suddenly the entire miserable mystery of the past 3 years made perfect mechanical sense. When I went to bed at night, I was lying completely flat. For the first time in 16 hours, my legs were level with my heart. Gravity was no longer holding the water in the basement. So all that fluid that had been trapped in my lower legs throughout the day suddenly came rushing back into my main circulatory system. My bloodstream was suddenly flooded with excess liquid. The kidneys are the filtration plant of the body. Their job is to keep the blood volume perfectly balanced. When I lay down and that massive wave of fluid re-entered the pipes, the kidneys panicked. They sensed a massive overflow and they went into overdrive to filter that water out of the blood and send it to the bladder. I was waking up at 2 in the morning with a full bladder, not because I drank a glass of water with dinner. I was waking up because my kidneys were processing the water that had been hiding in my legs all day. I was effectively drinking 2 large glasses of water the moment I laid down simply by changing my posture. The machine was working exactly as it was supposed to. It was frantically trying to pump the basement dry while I was trying to sleep. I sat in my armchair looking at my ankles, feeling a profound sense of foolishness. I had been dehydrating myself, making my life miserable, putting stress on my kidneys by depriving them of water during the day, all while ignoring the massive reservoir of fluid pooling in my own 2 legs. I had been trying to fix a foundation problem by changing the shingles on the roof. I asked Laura how to fix it. I expected her to tell me I needed a prescription diuretic, a water pill to force the kidneys to work harder during the day. I know a lot of men my age who take those pills. They spend their afternoons tied to the house because the medication forces them into the bathroom every 20 minutes. But Laura did not suggest a pill. She suggested a mechanical intervention. She told me I needed to drain the basement before I tried to go to sleep. She gave me a specific protocol. It was not complicated, but she insisted that the timing and the angles had to be exact. The intervention had to happen in the evening, a few hours before I intended to get into bed. The rule was simple. At 7 o'clock every evening, I was to lie flat on my back on the sofa in the living room. But lying flat was not enough. I had to elevate my legs so that my calves and feet were significantly higher than my heart. I used 3 thick throw pillows, stacking them under my lower legs until my heels were elevated a good 8 to 10 inches above the level of my chest. Laura explained that this posture completely reverses the gravitational pull. It opens the return pipes wide and lets the fluid pour out of the basement and back into the main circulatory system. But she added one more step. She called it priming the sump pump. While my legs were elevated, I had to actively flex my ankles, pointing my toes hard toward the far wall, and then pulling them back hard toward my face. 10 repetitions every few minutes. My son Daniel, the physical therapist in Denver, later explained the mechanics of this to me over the phone. He said the calf muscle is often called the second heart of the body. When you flex the ankle, you contract the massive muscle belly of the calf. That contraction literally squeezes the veins, forcefully wringing the fluid out of the tissues and shooting it up the pipes toward the kidneys. By elevating the legs above the heart and pumping the ankles, I was manually flushing the day's accumulation of fluid out of my lower extremities. I tried it that very night. At 7 o'clock, I turned on the television to watch the evening news, but instead of sitting in my armchair, I laid flat on the sofa. I stacked the pillows. I put my legs up. I felt a strange immediate pressure shift in my calves, a slight cooling sensation as the trapped fluid finally began to move. Every time a commercial came on, I pumped my ankles back and forth, wringing the sponge. I stayed in that position for 30 minutes. When I finally stood up at 7:30, I felt a sudden, urgent pressure in my bladder. The kidneys had received the flood of water and processed it immediately. I went to the bathroom and the volume was astonishing. It was the water that would have otherwise woken me up at 2 in the morning. I stayed awake for another few hours, reading a book in my chair. At 8:30, I went to the bathroom again. The sump pump had completely cleared the basement. At 10 o'clock, I went through my nightly inventory. I checked the locks, turned off the lamps, and adjusted the thermostat. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, but for the first time in years, the heavy knot of anticipation in my stomach was gone. I got into bed. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the room was bright. The sun was coming through the edges of the blinds. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was 6:15 in the morning. I laid there in the quiet Arizona morning, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. I had slept for 8 straight hours. No interruptions. No dark walks down the hallway. No frustrating cycles of waking and sleeping. For the first time in years, my body had been allowed to perform its most vital maintenance routine without the emergency alarm going off. When I stood up and walked to the kitchen to make coffee, the difference in my physical frame was staggering. My legs did not feel like wet cement. The fog behind my eyes was completely gone. I felt a steady, quiet energy that I had not felt since my late 60s. I realized in that moment just how deeply the sleep deprivation had been eroding my life. I had accepted a slow, creeping misery simply because I thought it was mandatory. I made the elevation routine a non-negotiable part of my daily existence. Every single evening, without fail, the pillows go on the sofa. The legs go up, the ankles get pumped. It is as routine as brushing my teeth or locking the front door. I do not rely on hope. I rely on mechanics. Once I understood the plumbing, I stopped restricting my water intake. I went back to drinking water normally throughout the afternoon and early evening, staying hydrated the way a man living in the desert should. Because I knew that as long as I drained the basement at 7 o'clock, my kidneys would clear the system before my head ever hit the pillow. There's a profound misunderstanding in our society about what sleep actually is. We treat it like an off switch, a period of inactivity where the body just powers down. But that is entirely backward. Sleep is the most active, violent period of physiological repair your body undergoes. When you achieve deep sleep, your brain literally shrinks slightly inside your skull, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to wash over the tissue, clearing out the toxic proteins and metabolic waste that accumulate during your waking hours. Your immune system deploys its heavy artillery, scanning for mutations, fighting low-grade infections, and reducing systemic inflammation. Your muscular system rebuilds torn fibers. Your cardiovascular system gets a desperate, necessary break from the high-pressure demands of the day. When you wake up 3 or 4 times a night to go to the bathroom, you are not just losing an hour of rest. You are interrupting the cleaning cycle. Imagine running a dishwasher, but opening the door every 10 minutes to check on the plates. The cycle stops, the water drains, and it has to start all over again. The dishes never get clean. When your sleep is broken, your brain never gets washed. The inflammation never subsides. The engine never cools down. Chronic sleep interruption is not just an inconvenience. It is a slow, steady dismantling of your biological defenses. It accelerates cognitive decline. It raises your resting blood pressure. It compromises your balance and your reaction time, which are the two things keeping you from falling and breaking a hip on the kitchen floor. The medical industry is quick to offer solutions that treat the symptom rather than the system. If you tell a doctor you are waking up to pee, the first instinct is often a pharmaceutical intervention to alter the behavior of the bladder or the prostate. And in some specific medical cases, those interventions are absolutely necessary. I am not telling anyone to ignore their physician, but what terrifies me, what angers me when I think about the men my father worked with back in the manufacturing plant, is how rarely anyone stops to look at the mechanics of the whole machine. How rarely anyone asks about the swelling in the ankles before prescribing a pill for the bladder. We have isolated the body into disconnected parts, assuming that a problem in the bathroom must originate in the pelvis. We forget that the water has to come from somewhere. We forget about gravity. I think about my wife Margaret often when I am lying on the sofa in the evening pumping my ankles and waiting for the fluid to drain. Margaret passed away in 2019. She was a wonderful woman, a school teacher who kept our lives organized and full of light. But in her later years, her sleep was terrible. She suffered from broken nights, waking up repeatedly, wandering the house, trying to find rest. We blamed her age. We blamed her nerves. We bought different mattresses and thicker curtains. I look back now, and I remember the way her shoes used to leave deep red marks across the tops of her feet by dinner time. I remember how heavy her legs looked in the evenings. We did not know about the basement. We did not know that the simple act of putting her feet up on a stack of pillows before bed might have given her back her nights, and by extension, given her back the energy of her days. I carry that knowledge with a heavy kind of grace. I cannot change the nights Margaret lost, but I can make sure I do not lose my own. And I can make sure I explain the mechanics to anyone who is willing to listen. When you reach your 70s and 80s, the horizon changes. You are no longer preparing for the future, you are actively defending the present. Independence is not a permanent state of being. It is a lease that you have to renew every single day through your habits, your discipline, and your willingness to understand the machine you live inside. Independence is the ability to drive your own truck to the hardware store. It is the ability to get down on the floor with your grandchildren and know without a shadow of a doubt that your legs have the strength to push you back up. It is the dignity of walking through your own house without a cane, your mind sharp, your balance steady. And that independence is forged in the dark. It is built during those 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. You cannot protect your days if you are surrendering your nights to a mechanical failure you have the power to fix. This I learned too late for me in some respects, but you still have time. The damage of broken sleep is cumulative, but the repair process is incredibly resilient. Your body desperately wants to heal. Your brain wants to wash itself. Your heart wants to rest. You just have to clear the obstacles out of the way. Do not accept exhaustion as a mandatory condition of your age. Do not assume that the warning lights on the dashboard are just a malfunction. Look at the foundation. Look at the mechanics. Tonight, before you go through your own evening inventory, before you check the locks and turn off the lamps, take 30 minutes to deal with gravity. Lay flat. Stack the pillows. Elevate your heels above your heart. Pump your ankles and wring out the sponge. Flush the pipes while you are still awake. Give your kidneys the chance to clear the basement before you ask your body to shut down. What you ignore today can severely limit you tomorrow. But what you maintain today, the simple mechanical habits you build and respect, will protect your autonomy for the years you have left. Do the work. Drain the system. Reclaim your rest. I'll see you next time.